Well, good afternoon to this august audience. After the blockbuster session that we just had, it's a tough act to follow, but we shall try. And I'm sure we should be able to do it because we've got a very distinguished panel of trade experts. I'm just a dabbler in trade, but then what we have here is a power-packed panel of two. We have Mr. Pradeep Mehta, who does not need an introduction, primarily because if I actually begin to introduce him, I'll spend about half an hour doing that. He has been an advisor to almost every important body in the field of trade, whether it be the Commerce Ministry or the World Trade Organization. We have with us Mr. Shishir Priyadarshi, who after working in the Indian government as an IAS officer, moved on to the world stage and worked in the WTO for long years. He has been heading the development section of the WTO and works there as a director. He's also been spearheading the program of Aid for Trade. And what I wish to hold your attention for the next 30 minutes, not counting this introduction, because I presume that is not counted in 30 minutes, is whether India should pivot to regional trade agreements and one-on-one trade agreements rather than depend upon the global multilateral system. I have tweaked the topic a little bit because what I was asked to talk about was whether India should do one-on-one trade agreements versus regional and multilateral trade agreements. What we wish to do as per the consent of the panel is that we will place regional trade agreements and one-on-one trade agreements in one basket and then compare them to the multilateral trading system and talk about as to what works best for India. In short, if I may summarize, when we talk about one-on-one or regional trade agreements vis-a-vis a multilateral system like WTO, we are talking about whether we do business with friends or we do business primarily in an impersonal system driven by rules on which we may not have any control, but which is more likely to be fair. That's, of course, a point of debate. People may debate whether it actually is going to be fair or doing business with friends is the best world that you want to live in. However, there is an institutional dimension to this debate, and that is what my respected panelists would dwell upon. I have an easy job. I would be asking questions. Questions which I thought are tough, but my coffee discussions with the panelists made me realize that, well, they're probably elementary for them. However, let me begin. And I will begin with Mr. Pradeep Mehta. The first question is, where do you see one-on-one trade agreements and regional trade agreements fitting in within the multilateral trading system?
Well, I mean, they complement each other in the sense that one is a building block in a way to say. Some people call it a stumbling block, but one doesn't have to look at it in that particular way. You know, ever since the WTO came into being in 1995, at least until from then to now, over 500 such non-multilateral agreements have been signed. So it is not something which is new. India was hesitant to begin with for a long time. India and European Union both of entering into non-multilateral agreements. And we did that only when we found that the multilateral agenda is not moving forward in the manner that we would have wanted it to go. Thank you.
So would you like to?
Sure. Look, one, apologies for imposing myself again on you. I hope I'm not surfacing like a bad apple again and again, but since I was here and this is something about global trade, probably justifies my flying in from Geneva a little bit more. You know, this is a debate that has been going on in the World Trade Organization for us for a long time. And I don't think they've reached a conclusion yet. It's probably like seeing regionalism as a second best solution, but not wanting to throw out the second best solution like the baby and the bathtub. You're striving to improve the coverage and the consistency of regional arrangements with the multilateral framework, but I think there's still a big gap.
Thank you, sir. Second question, and I would begin with Mr. Shishir Priyadarshi. Some officials, in various interactions that I have, and maybe many of us have heard, have expressed the view that in the world of trade, it is primarily national interests that should predominate, we should all look out only for ourselves, it's every man for himself, self-interest should rule. Where do you think that leaves us if that really becomes the predominant national policy? Because do you think there should be an environment in which we should concede the minimal and try to get the maximum out of the trading system? Where do you think are the implications for rule of law in the international trading system if this view predominates?
That's a slightly tough question, and I'll tell you why. For 20 years, I wore the Indian hat at the WTO, and obviously I was looking at India's self-interest. And the next 20 years, I've been wearing a WTO hat, where it's strongly rule of law. Look, my take, perhaps, on this is that there's absolutely no harm. In fact, every country should strive to protect its self-interest, no doubt about it. But you also need the rule of law, because unless there is certainty and predictability in a country's policy regime, investment regime, you are not going to be able to attract FDI. You're not going to be able to attract technology. So you've got to find this golden mean between self-interest and the rule of law. What would be my suggestion is when the rule of law is being written, when the rules of law are being negotiated, you should be very much in there. You should be inside the room, because only then can you ensure that your self-interest in a way also get grandfathered into the rules of law being negotiated. But there is always a small problem. The problem is that within that room, you'll find lots of people wanting to grandfather their self-interest into those rules of law. And that's where the whole issue of both give and take, the issue of long-term occasional loss, a short-term occasional loss to a long-term gain. And again, as I'd mentioned in the morning, weighing both the opportunities and challenges. But scope exists, and I think that's the most important thing, is to be inside the room when the rule of law is being negotiated to ensure that your self-interest is preserved.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mehta, please.
Following on from what Shishir just mentioned, from the last point which he made, being inside the room doesn't help you to actually craft the rules the way you want. It's an unequal world. The WTO, it's a mercantile agreement. It's not a friends agreement, as it were. And there's no friendship in this particular village or the jungle of trade. As it stands today, it is an iniquitous world. Now, what we try to do is, among the developed and the developed, and you still have the north-south divide in the WTO itself, or including, you look at the climate change agreement as well, on what there wasn't much said in the last session. But even there, you'll find the same north-south friction going on along and along. Now, what I'm only trying to say, these are pragmatic realities. When it comes back to trade, what Shishir mentioned is something which I would like to expand is give and take, in the sense that there are always trade-offs. So you try to make the best out of something by giving concessions on something which you may not have wanted to do. And that is where quite often in our own headlines, you'll find people shouting that, look, the minister has sold the country. Minister has not sold the country. What he's tried to do is try to get the best out of what you can possibly get. And that is something which you must understand. But let me again reiterate and conclude this point, that it is an iniquitous world. Like you go to a village, it's the Chaudhry who's still the commanding force. And the poor again and again get oppressed or beaten at times. So it's the same thing. It's a human tendency. Thank you.
Well, my third question is for Mr. Mehta. We'll begin with you, and then Mr. Pradarshi can add. India has signed 13 FTAs and 6 limited coverage preferential trade agreements. That's the data as was reported in the Parliament. Now, this has increased the coverage of trade agreements of India's trade, and this coverage seems to be creeping up. Now, there are a lot of talks about agreements with the European Union, UK, and even US, especially post the signing of the trade agreement with UAE and Australia. I believe the coverage has increased. And if we include all of this, I do not know, I do not have the exact numbers, possibly one of the panelists may have. The coverage could go north of 60 or 70% of trade. Whether we include the tariff lines or not, that's a different thing, but at least the FTA countries' trade could end up being 70% or more. Now, in a situation where a hugely predominant part of our trade is with FTA countries, where does that leave the relevance of the multilateral system?
No, as Shishir said very clearly in his beginning that, these are issues of choices in the sense that, this is not replacing the multilateral system, but what additional benefits you can get. Now, the agreements that we have signed so far have not been 100%. They are 50% of Australia or UAE, the last two agreements you're talking about, they're not even 40%. I beg your pardon, Australia. UAE may be, full and doesn't have such a large coverage as such. Now, agreed that we are also now negotiating agreements with the UK, Canada, EU, etc. Now, EU is something which we have been demanding, our businesses are demanding because it's a big market. Now, US is also a big market, but there are too many difficulties there, what we call red lines. There are too many difficulties for us to be able to, get any kind of agreement. With the EU, we have agreed to the social clause, which is something which is very unusual because we've always been opposing, including in the latest statement which came out from the industries minister, commerce minister from Los Angeles on the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement that, we'll take everything but for the trade pillar at the moment. I mean, he didn't say no to the trade pillar. He says we are not a part of the trade pillar. And one of the arguments there was the issue about social clauses. Social clauses are basically issues relating to environmental standards or labor standards, human rights, and so on and so forth, which we find difficult because we may not be able to maintain the same standards. We have not developed to that extent as well. Number one. Number two is that they are often used for protectionist purposes by rich countries. I mean, they misuse these kind of conditionalities, as has been seen in many cases. Now, the point is that we will continue to explore what better avenues we can get. And EU, as I said, has been strongly demanded by our industry because we get outbeaten by other competitors from, say, Bangladesh or Vietnam or Cambodia, etc. So it is in our interest that in our net interest we will gain. Net. This is what I was saying earlier that, you can't have, you have to look at the net impact rather than just the gross impact of any particular issue. Thank you.
Mr. Priyadarshi, would you like to add?
Well, I mean, very little to add after what Pradeep has said. But, I was saying that the two have to coexist. But to perhaps elaborate that point, the WTO helps to make trade flow more freely. How? By reducing tariffs. And regional arrangements or bilateral arrangements try and make you do that faster. So if the multilateral trading system, and I'm saying it very simply, tries to reduce tariffs to say 10% in a particular area, then your bilateral deal would get it down to 0. That's as far as tariffs is concerned, and I think there, obviously, the bilateral arrangements have a WTO plus role to play. They'll take the reduction deeper. But there's another aspect to the WTO and the multilateral trading system, which is to try to make the playing field level. And my emphasis is on the word try. As Pradeep said, it's still very often a fight amongst unequals. But there are certain things, for instance, which distort trade. There are agricultural subsidies, there are fishery subsidies, there's dispute resolution. And a lot of these issues cannot be addressed in bilateral agreements. So the point that I think we are both making is that the two need to coexist. You go on to a deeper tariff reduction dive in bilateral agreements with strategic partners possibly, yet at the same time, a country like India continues to play a very proactive role in the multilateral trading system by trying to work towards removing the distortions in trade. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, going on the same theme of dispute resolution, Do you think that the dispute resolution in WTO currently, is it in a very healthy situation, or do you think something needs to be done about it? That's part number one of the question. And the second question, which I've been thinking for some time, I don't know if it's a wacky idea or not, which is that in a regional trade agreement, if your regional trading partner does not honor his commitments, what do you do? I mean, it's a gentleman's agreement after all. And there may not be too many gentlemen in international trade. So you may have to depend upon the goodness of the other person to fulfill their commitments. Sometimes the agreement will have certain arbitration clauses, dispute resolution clauses. I have not seen them too much in action. So do you think that if the dispute resolution system of WTO being at what state it is in, if it improves, do you think at some stage it can evolve to even cover regional trade agreements? WTO can find maybe new relevance in being the honest broker between two contracting parties? So those are two questions, part A, part B.
Okay. I knew the minute I mentioned dispute resolution, I would get a question on what is clearly at the moment, does leave many of us working in the WTO a bit red-faced. Because when the WTO was set up, its dispute resolution system, which was binding, completely binding, was touted as the jewel in the crown. But for the last about 4 years, the dispute resolution system is in a limbo. We do not have the appellate jurisdiction simply because the United States has completely blocked the appointment of new judges. And WTO being a consensus-based organization, even if one member says no, so we are in a limbo. Having said that, I think as far as the regional arrangements are concerned, Manasvi, your suggestion is excellent. I'll tell you what the ground exists now. Pradeep talked about 500 odd regional arrangements, some in the process. Non-multilateral. Now, at least if you looked at the RTAs and the FTAs amongst them, the regional trading arrangements and the free trade agreements, about 1/3 of them have a dispute resolution chapter. Now, that chapter could probably go in two directions. In some of them, they say that if parties to a FTA and RTA have a dispute, they'll go to the WTO. Obviously, this is the good old days. Alternatively, they also provide for some mechanism in which a dispute would be settled amongst them. But about 2/3 of the FTAs and RTAs have no mention of dispute resolution. And that's where I think your suggestion is very valid. We'll have to find a way to address it if FTAs are going to stay here, if FTAs are going to be negotiated more and more, like India is doing, then you will need to factor in the possibility of parties to the agreement running into a difference of opinion, which needs to be settled amicably. And I think your session's a good one. Pradeep.
Just to add a few footnotes to what Shishir spoke about, the dispute settlement system in the WTO used to be voluntary before the WTO came into being, the GATT. There was a dispute panel, it came to a decision, the parties could agree to it or not agree to implement it. It became mandatory under the WTO regime. Now, what has happened, there is a panel which is comprises of people like you and me, generally trade experts, who are normally a panel of 3, which comprises of members from the impugned countries and the countries which are fighting. And there is an appellate body, which is a standing body of judges. Again, they could be judicial and non-judicial people both. What the US has done has to withhold approval of the appointment of judges, with the result the appellate body is dead. As it stands today, it is dead, and therefore all the disputes are, whatever the panel judgments are lying in limbo as such. Now, the beauty about this is, and just a bit of history I thought is important for us to remind the audience. The Havana Charter, where the whole issue about the GATT was discussed in 1948, the year I was born, there was a discussion about an international trade organization like the WTO, which came into being now, which included a dispute resolution system the way it is now, it was shot down by the US Congress. They said we cannot allow our sovereignty to be challenged multilaterally in an outside forum. That's the kind of hegemonistic flavor or thinking which existed then, and that continues to operate even today. This is important. Shishir is an international civil servant. He's not going to be as blunt as I am. And therefore, somebody has to call a spade a spade. This is the problem today is this. Secondly, the inequity of the system is, let me give you one example of the inequity of the system which exists. Understanding that developing countries are at a lesser status than the developed countries, there's a provision of what is called special and differential treatment, which is that in many cases you will get longer term lines for implementation, etc., and you will get other concessions as well. But that has not been done in the manner in which it was envisaged, and we raised this problem in Doha in 2001, but that has not been resolved as yet. On the contrary, this is the example of inequity, and Shishir mentioned the issue about agriculture subsidies. Now, agriculture subsidies in the West are absolutely dirty and vulgar. The reputation goes that they are subsidizing even their cow with $2 a day. And that special and differential treatment is enforceable. You can't challenge it. And that has been a big debate in the WTO since a long time, including in the last ministerial, which was held, and it was not taken up as such. I'm just giving an example of this to understand what is the inequity of the system, which we must understand. Now, therefore, going back to this whole issue in the RTAs, of course, the dispute settlement system in the non-multilateral agreements are usually bilateral in the sense that, it could be arbitration, as you rightly said, Mr. Moderator, but idea is very good that, the WTO dispute resolution system, if it is resurrected, mind you, it has to be resurrected. This is not to be revived. It's totally dead now. And the last ministerial agreement has to agree to launch a process to resurrect it. Now, I don't know, God knows how long it will take. Biden doesn't seem to enjoy that kind of comfort level with the US Congress at all in order to push for any kind of, radical change in the WTO. Not radical, this is just restoring, as I said, what used to be a good system in the past. So we'll continue to face this, but if that happens, then there could be an agreement, and that's very sensible, as even Shishir agrees. All right-thinking people say, let all disputes relating to trade, whether they are in the WTO or outside the WTO, could be taken to the same dispute resolution system. The same thing also applies to investment disputes. That's again a very important thing, which we have not discussed. Investment is a related issue, but there has been a proposal for a World Investment Court also. Anyway, thank you.
So I understand that, yes, this is definitely a topic on which we can talk for hours, and it is a key point when people talk about the WTO. Given the fact that we are short on time, I'm looking at the clock, 6 minutes. I'm sure we'll be able to wrap up the last question that I have. I've cut down one question, which is that, given your experience, what do you think India should be doing, both on the field of multilateral institutions, participating in the multilateral institutions of trade, and in the regional trade agreements, which has not been done up till now? Also, keeping in mind that the theme of this conference is repurposing India. So how do we repurpose our engagement in multilateral institutions as well as regional trade agreements? Any new thoughts?
Thanks, Manasvi. Look, over the last, 20-odd minutes, I think this is exactly what we've done. One, traced India's history from the late 90s when India, I must say, opposed any non-multilateral agreements, to a period, I would say, from about 2001 to 2010, when India signed a fairly large number of such agreements, largely with its eastern neighbors, to a hiatus from about 2011 to perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, when we didn't even initiate any agreements which were already in the pipeline, came to a standstill, and the last 2, 3 years when we've been pushing ahead. That's on the bilateral side. Unfortunately, I think on the multilateral side, and I would probably exclude the present ministerial conference which just happened and the present regime which represented India at that ministerial conferences. For many in the past, and I hope Pradeep you'd agree, rightly or wrongly, India has often seemed to be perceived as an obstructionist member of the WTO rather than a facilitating member. It is changing, and I think part of the reason is only this, is that we always have our wish list on the table, not willing to accept that a wish list will only come about through payment. It's a very standard thing, but that's something we don't accept. My own sense, to answer your question, is that India absolutely, positively, necessarily has to be proactively inside the room. You know, Pradeep said, just being inside the room is not enough, and I agree. You've got to be strong, you've got to be proactive. You've got to look for allies, but you've got to also be prepared to go alone. And there must be some consistency in what you do nationally and what you do internationally. And I'll end with one small example to just explain this point. Right over the last 3 years, I think there's been a strong thrust within India on digitalization. You had a fantastic session this morning on digitalization. If you hear the Prime Minister's speeches over the last 2 years, the word digital, the word e-commerce, the word Paytm, all this stuff, everything done with digitalization is high on the agenda. And yet India is one of the few countries which opposes any discussion on digital trade in the WTO. And even though I don't represent India, but when I'm asked smilingly by my colleagues, why don't you tell us why is India opposing this, I don't have an answer. But here, my suggestion has always been, and apologies, and I will end with that, is the example is very similar to being on a train whose destination you may not like. Now, you have two alternatives. Don't get into the train, stay on the platform. But if you're being invited to get into the engine of the train with the possibility of making it go slightly slower, faster, maybe even changing direction, then my personal view is it's better to be on the engine than let aside on the platform. Thanks.
Very appropriately said, sir.
I think Shishir deserves a big applause for what he said, the last statement. And this is the tragedy that India has always been a naysayer. A very famous British diplomat once said that, and on the contrary, that it's so difficult to stop an Indian delegate from speaking. On the contrary, it is so difficult to get a Chinese delegate to speak. You can very well understand the idea. Now, that is something which I've observed very closely for the last 30 years now. See, we have good, eloquent negotiators, but very vacuous, to be very honest. And they have a little understanding about many of these issues in the sense that, and therefore we often lose sight of the ultimate goal that we have. We need trade liberalization. We have raised our tariffs unnecessarily. This is not something which is very happy. And there are a lot of people in this country who are opposing it, including Sunil, for example. We have been talking about liberalizing the... See, we Indians are inherently good, solid entrepreneurs. You give the space to us, we can reach the moon. Today, as they said, it costed us less than running a Vespa scooter or a Bajaj scooter than to reach Mars. If you look at the cost of sending a mission to Mars was concerned. If we are capable of that, we don't even speak. In the digital trade, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be shocked to know that we are so innovative. There are two things which India has done which nobody else has done in the world. And we should be proud about that. The ONDC, the Open Network of Digital Commerce, is absolutely innovative, it's just mind-blasting. And nobody in the world has thought about that, that you have a free open highway for any trader to, or any consumer to sell and buy. Secondly, the UPI, the United Payments Interface System. Again, it's so revolutionary that at least 16 countries abroad have adopted it. Now, we are so used to getting everything from America that our minds seem to have got numbed that we are not capable of doing innovative things. We are capable of doing many innovative things. I give you just two examples, and there are many such examples I can talk about. The point is that we are capable. And we have to allow our, sort of animal spirits unbound, And that, unfortunately, is not happening. And the one person, which of course the Honorable Prime Minister is somebody who's very gung-ho about it, but then he gets blocked by various other forces. A little bit of advertising, if those of you read Economic Times, there's my article today in the Economic Times on the edit page in terms of how we have said no to the trade pillar in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement at Los Angeles. I mean, it's so, I would term it very, very incorrect, except that Shishir felt it was baffling as to how do we do these kind of things. We have not said no, but we have not said that we are willing to join it at all. And that has sent a very bad signal, generally speaking. And therefore, please have a look at it. You'll find it very enlightening in order to particularly answer some of the basic fundamental questions that you raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the distinguished panel and to this august audience for their patience. So we take home the message that we should be in the driving engine of world trade rather than sit on the platform, and that we should not be afraid to unleash the animal spirits. We may not need all that much protection that many people think we do need. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen. Would request Ms. Dipali Nair ji, Director Digital Sales IBM, to kindly grace the stage and present the mementos to our esteemed group of panelists. Zordar taaliyan ma'am ke liye. Welcome, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Come here.